мальчиком, естественно, я был и видел и вот эти бомбежки, и когда уже мы переправлялись через Волгу, бежали на Урал. Вот мама, маленький новорожденный брат. Вот, и это было ночью, переправлялись через Волгу в Сталинграде. Это октябрь 42 года. И на пароме, в Теплушке на пароме, а Сталинград — это город на правом берегу Волги, на высоком берегу, и длинный-длинный город. По тем временам 60 километров в длину, а дальше холмы, а потом степь. А сейчас 120 километров, может, уже и больше. Ну, короче, город кишка. И вот этот весь город горел. Весь. До неба. Но горела река. Вот эти 1,5 километра шириной, вода горела. Вылилась нефть, какие-то нефтехранилища разбомбили, и они стекли все в воду, и горела река. И плюс еще и нас бомбили. То есть она кипела еще и от бомб. Это река, на нас ложились, мамы наши, накрывали нас какими-то там одеялами, подушками, а сверху еще на нас ложились. Естественно, и высовывался оттуда, как это не видеть. Ну, а потом долго ехали на Урал. Отец оставался в городе и защищал его. Вот поэтому дело в том, что у меня остались очень сильные детские впечатления от этого времени, от этого ада. А я действительно побывал в аду.
The hell Klimov describes is not unique to him. Although the Soviet Union emerged technically victorious from World War II, casualties from the war and related causes had reached around 27 million by the end. Mass destruction, systematized rape, and widespread starvation forever changed the cultural landscape of Russia and Eastern Europe. Come and See, Klimov says in another interview, quote, is a memory about war, a people's memory about the war. And it was meant to be a people's film. That is, the recollections of the most horrible moments of the war. On the other hand, the main thrust, the main point of this film, was directed towards the present. It stands as a warning for all about war itself, or I might say, a passionate warning against the war. In this way, Come and See is an essentially evental text. Its mix of surrealism and realism is specifically treated to this people's memory, reflecting the sensory overwhelm of the war event, a violent experience which can only begin to be intelligible in retrospect. The film struggles throughout with this intelligibility. The moving camera follows characters closely, huddling with them behind the corpse of a cow as it dies, tucked into a shelter after a bombing. We are brought closer to the war in this way, but the film seems aware of the audience. They're removed from the text and therefore the event. This awareness, which generates the aforementioned off-screen space which can never become an on-screen space, seems to fulfill Klimov's main thrust, and this sense of warning against reaches a fever pitch in the Parakoti sequence. The extended massacre comes on the viewer like a dark cloud, as the Einsatzgruppe descends on the village. The close-ups and moving camera shots seem now at the service of a grotesque carnival of violence, seeming almost to implicate the viewer in the evil. Scholar Ben Smith writes, the lengthy sequence in which an SS division destroys Parakoti is among the most perversely euphoric ever to occur in a film about war. The Parakoti sequence has a precise role in turning the audience's gaze away from the representation itself and towards its source. Here the camera effectively joins with the Nazis rather than retaining detachment, and turns these strategies into direct correlatives of the Nazis' own aesthetic of destruction. Throughout this sequence, the formal strategies are unpicked and given functions and origins in the immediate environment. The vast camera sweeps are now at the service of the swerving motorcycles and juddering armored divisions. The soldiers stare and laugh into the camera, showing little effort to interact with each other, as though fully aware of its presence and its recording function, and not trapped by its gaze like Florian and his compatriots. The screams of the burning villagers have been anticipated by the cacophonous sounds used earlier, and the German songs that form a constituent part of the film's soundtrack are sourced here in the enormous PA system rigged up to accompany the massacre. As the sequence reaches its climax, with grenades being tossed into the village hall, the soldiers burst into a round of applause. This is Klimov's grotesque parody of Himself and Us. We are made to feel that our sense of aesthetic satisfaction at this extraordinary piece of filmmaking is complicit with the Nazi actions. The viewer is not only aware of the historical truth of the atrocity, but that it is rooted in humanity. This sequence, as the aforementioned quote notes, almost brings the viewer into the diegetic present. You feel the heat of the burning barn and smell the stench of the acrid smoke. Although Come and See is in many ways an evental text about a child and a nation who experience an unbidden, violent trauma that forever changes their world, the film also causes the viewer to consider the impossibility of an event point, a single space in the diegesis wherein the essential shift happens. Florian begins the story with an innocence that is eventually lost, but even in the beginning sequence, Klimov's warning is given voice by a villager scolding Florian and his young friend, cautioning them from joining the partisans, lest their village comes under fire again, which it of course does later in the film. This sequence gives the viewer a feeling of aftermath. Florian digs a gun out of the sand as if it's an archaeological artifact. He and his young companion are already well trained in hitting the ground when a plane flies over, dropping propaganda. The film ends with Florian disappearing into a group of marching partisans, with Mozart's Requiem playing. This ending shot, while simple, imposes the brutal truth that we must all continue our lives despite trauma in an extremely affecting way. We want to rescue Florian, but he marches on into an indifferent world. Years left until the war is won. And the movie's over. In this way, Come and See merely dips the audience into the experience of war, something which cannot be said to have a beginning and ending event, a series of contingencies and causations that transform nations not through the single Aktionen, the SS name for village burnings, but through extended attrition. The viewer is left in the film's wake exhausted and changed. Klimov, if anything else, has succeeded in warning the viewer against fascism and war. Thank you for watching this presentation, and I apologize if any of the material was upsetting. If you feel up to watching this movie, I highly recommend it. I also recommend to make sure to engage in self-care before and after watching the movie because, as I think I made clear, it's a very intense experience. This next slide is a list of all of my sources.